Right, welcome everyone. My name is Will. You can call me Contraband. And this is the Contraband Wagon where we're changing the conversation on race. Thank you so much for joining me for another conversation series event where we have 2-hour live conversations on race. But before I get into our guests for today, I really want to talk to you guys about our patrons who are funding this and supporting the creation of these conversations and all the events we do with the Contraband Wagon. And I want to give them all a big thank you because without your support, I couldn't continue creating these spaces and doing this stuff. So thank you so much. I really appreciate your support. And don't forget, anyone can be a part of the Contraband Wagon. All you need to do is go to my website, www.thecontrabandwagon.com, scroll down to the Submit Application button, click on that button, and you can go ahead and fill out the very short application. I'll get back to you via email, inviting you to a 30-minute pre-interview conference where I'll give you all the rest of the details, and we'll talk a little bit about what we might talk about live here on the channel, and then we'll pick a time for you to come on the show. So it's easy. Anyone can do it. Feel free to apply, www.thecontrabandwagon.com. We also have open discussion events. If kind of coming on here, having a live conversation, even anonymously, our guest today is anonymous. So like anyone can come on, even if you would like to be anonymous. But if you just would rather have a more intimate type of conversation, maybe a chance for just a few people to listen to you and to get some feedback, or just to listen to what other people are saying about issues that you're interested in the race space, then you could come to one of our open discussion events, okay? If you go to my meetup page, www.meetup.com/racism discussion group, you'll go ahead and you'll see that we have once a month open discussion events. These are 10 people or less, round robin discussions on race. We go around the circle. You can pass every single time if you want and just listen, or you can bring up any question or comment, and we just go around the circle having conversation like that. Everyone who's come to these events has really enjoyed them and had a great experience, and we've had many repeat attendees. The next one is actually happening in 5 days from today, December 10th. So it's December 15th from 7 p.m. to 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. If you are interested, you can just go to my meetup page and sign up for the Racism Discussion Group. Again, www.meetup.com/racism discussion group. And it's all free. Everything here is free, guys. So definitely avail yourself of these opportunities. Okay. So without any further delay, let's get into our guest for today. So our guest for today, Silent Cow, we were speaking on Twitter about changes in education, motivated by this kind of reinvigorated discussion about critical race theory. And that's kind of like how we started talking and how I ended up inviting Silent Cow to be on the show. So Silent Cow, our anonymous guest for today, excited to have you, another Twitter follower here on the Contraband Wagon. Welcome to the show, my man.
Thanks so much, Will. Appreciate the invite and taking the time, and I'm sure I'll learn some things, but also appreciate the opportunity to kind of be a part of what you're doing, because I think it's important work and something that conversations like this and putting things out there and getting people to talk hopefully is part of things getting better in the country. So really
I totally agree. That's exactly what I'm trying to do here. I'm so glad you started off like that, because I want to make sure that people are aware that that's the reason I'm having these conversations, that I'm not out here trying to, be a grifter or whatever, like people say. It does like cost me significantly in order to create this stuff. I mean, I'm definitely like shelling out way more than I'm getting back at this point. So like, I'm just trying to improve our racial environment, in any way that I can, just like I want to encourage all of my viewers to do as well. So I appreciate you recognizing that and wanting to be a part of that, because that's what we need out here. We need people like you.
It's always interesting to me to see how the interactions on Twitter can often be so negative, and our interaction, it's hard to communicate. Communication is actually difficult, and it takes so much goodwill and even being charitable, trying to interpret. You kept asking me, I don't understand what you mean. And me taking that correctly as you meaning you're not communicating in a way where I know what you mean, literally, as opposed to I don't want to understand what you mean, which, Twitter's its own kind of special place, but often I'm fail to appreciate how much people don't want to communicate. And that's part of the issue versus our interaction was a little different. And, and it doesn't mean it's easy. Like people come from very different places. It is hard to communicate about some of these topics. And, one of the things I've been having as a kind of repeated theme when I have these conversations on Twitter is try to read people charitably. What could they mean? And that can't go too far. There's people who sometimes you need to say, no, they're saying what they're saying. And they're, let's not sugarcoat what they're saying. This is their position. But I have felt personally like often I'm read very uncharitably in some of the spaces as I had a discussion on trans rights with somebody. I'm massively, in my view, supportive of trans rights, of gendering people correctly and being respectful. And I somehow got typed as I was against it, and then we couldn't get out of that little space. And on race, sometimes that happens as well, where it's in camps. You mentioned critical race theory, and it's just been very disheartening to see the level of discourse. It's almost the discourse about the discourse, and then it's but what should we actually We have public schools. What should the policy be? We have communities. What should the policy? And I really, one of my things I care about. And I'm not an activist like you. I don't have the same level of time commitment to it, but we do a little bit of philanthropy, and one of the goals for me is policy. Let's put some policy wins on the board.
Yeah, I mean, I'm totally with you with all of that. I definitely have had a very similar experience with Twitter and social media in terms of finding these pockets of negativity that are insane, for lack of a better word, right? Where insanity rules, and what is true and what's real doesn't really matter, right? It's about game playing and locking people into positions so that you can, crap on them or whatever. And it is very odd, but I'm thankful that that's only mostly online, and that in reality, in real life, when you sit down and when you talk to people, even when you get a group together, like I do with the discussion group, that if you actually create these type of dialogues in person, face to face, that they go a lot differently. And I think that a lot of people experience that in a lot of other contexts where you're comparing virtual communication versus in-person communication. I know I've experienced that as a mathematics teacher, teaching mathematics through the computer versus teaching it in person. There's certain things that you can't do through a computer that you can do in person, even in that teaching context. And it facilitates better communication sometimes. But also, on the other hand, I have found more fluid communication through this type of video chatting medium in some regards. I think mostly because it's easier to keep people's attention on here than in person. So, there's a trade-off there. But in terms of the social media space, like you said, Twitter is its own unique universe, that people are still discovering, that's constantly changing and warping. So I just try to encourage everyone to realize that Twitter is not necessarily reality, and that we shouldn't act like it is either. I think, of course, people on there are real. I'm not saying that. Of course, there's many, many bots, but and people pretending to be other things, right? But I think in general, most people are, talking from a place of where they actually are. But again, they're not just being free with their words because of the anonymity. They're, I don't know, Twitter breeds a kind of, I don't know, abrasiveness, aggressiveness. Yeah. I mean, I'll say for me, it's really easy for me to determine whether someone's really interested in communicating or not. Because a big part of my job as an instructor is to, I have to connect with my students, right? I have to know that they're actually receiving the information that I'm trying to give them. So I have a lot of ways of telling whether that's happening and whether they want that to happen. And it's very easy to do in writing, actually. And so for
Yeah,
me, that's a easy skill for me. But a lot of people have no idea that that's even possible. So,
sure,
so
sure.
so I get into these things sometimes on Twitter where I'm like, yeah, I can already like see the barriers here, and because I use Twitter a lot, I understand that we're probably not going to get through this conversation by tweeting back and forth at each other. Why don't we try a different medium? So sometimes I'll suggest a different medium, like the kind of conversation we're having now, but privately, right? In order to continue the conversation. But then people are skeptical of that, and then like, or like they turn it, twist it around, and they're like, oh, like you don't really want to engage, why do you want to have a Zoom and this and that? And I'm just like, I told you, just to facilitate better communication. But, I've had many, many of those conversations where the person wants to go back and forth with me on Twitter, but doesn't want to talk even anonymously on
Right.
Zoom. So,
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm anonymous, which, is sort of, I wasn't always anonymous on Twitter, and it in my view, being able to have conversations where you're not worried about that in terms of there are things that have happened where people, have real life consequences for things, and there should be on some level. I mean, there's a level where I think people are very accountable for what they say and should. But my point in actually being anonymous was that I wanted to have some of these conversations, and be able to think out my own thoughts and write, and not feel like if somebody was, unreasonable, that they could attack me or it could affect my family or whatever. And frankly, my wife's was insisted at some point, if I wanted to have some of these conversations, that I'd be anonymous, because there's not individually on some of these conversations, or just doing your part, it is sometimes not just about you, right? It's about a shared collective effort to change the situation. And I felt like I could engage more productively anonymously, and I was required to, by my partner, so that helped. But
well,
yeah, I've had that same experience.
I want to be totally transparent here and just find out, do you really view it that way, or do you not think that it's mostly for protection?
Oh, both. No, both. It is a level of protection that then means that you can go into territory and be honest and say what you think and not be concerned about that. So it's not protection in terms of I don't think I matter. I'm not anybody. I don't matter in terms of why would somebody care who I am? I don't think it would matter to anyone. And I'm certainly not. I think at any particular risk of saying something where, you know any material number of people in society would want to dissociate from me because of my views. I'm quite proud of my views, right? Like, it's something I'm sure you encounter on this topic, is people have their variety of views, but they tend to like their own views. That's why they have them. So I don't think I don't have a high level of fear, but it was more of a prudent thing. And I think there's a lot of caution, like where you talked about the difference between Twitter conversations that can be very negative, and then when you have real life conversations with people, they're different, and they are. And I completely agree with what you said, which is they're more respectful, they're more productive. It isn't negative in the same way. I mean, if I talk to people in my community, from whatever race or cross racial lines, you know, whatever, there's plenty of people in our community who have interracial marriages of various types, and it's just those discussions are naturally respectful to people in your community. um, I think there's protection there where people are very guarded now in terms of how they talk about race, even among friends. So, for about 10 years, I ran a over email in writing politics group before Twitter was so much a thing, with a group of friends from high school, college, and then work colleagues, and various spouses and significant others from that group that extended out, because people would kind of add them. And as it got a little larger, I knew everyone, but some people didn't know each other. I'd get a lot of people break the thread off and just want to talk to me one on one. Where the point of it was it was a forum where you had an audience. There's like an accountability to writing down your thoughts. Like, if I'm writing for 30 people that I respect and have a relationship with, and I give them my thoughts on, the political election or some policy change or a Supreme Court case, to put my own thoughts in writing, there's a different standard when your audience is a group of people you have a relationship with and a lot of respect. And I like that rigor. And with Twitter, I think we stopped doing that around when some of the last stuff was when Trump got elected, and I was very, upset about it, and wrote to the group, et cetera. And the conversation in the country became more toxic. And that group kind of stopped doing it. And Twitter, I kind of also had to go on Twitter because Donald Trump was president and like news was getting made on Twitter. And so I joined Twitter really when he was a candidate because it kind of, Twitter became, it's weird to think of it that way, but like it just became more prominent in society because of his, everything.
Yeah, you're totally right about that. I actually joined Twitter. I just had my 3 year anniversary on Twitter. And I only joined it to end up, doing exactly what I'm doing now, right? Which is finding people, finding guests on there. I didn't know how successful I would be at it. I thought it was just one of many tools I would use to procure people to come on the show and have start conversations. But it has turned out to be an exceptional tool to network and to connect with people. Um, this technology, while there's definitely some cons in terms of communication, there's a lot of untapped potential in how connected we are through technology now. And it's kind of fun to tap into it a little bit in this kind of unique and I think very worthy way. Um, all right, so let's kind of get into a little bit of what we were actually, the
Sure.
meat of what we were talking about in terms of education policy. So you were like, let's focus on policy. Let's get some policies through. What good policies related to, the current critical race theory discussion do you think we should try to employ, and what policies do you think that people are trying to push that maybe we should rethink or not implement?
Yeah. So the most prominent negative is this, really illegal reaction that we've had to and I think it's been called a moral panic on the right. The state laws that people putting in where it's illegal for a teacher to talk about racism in American history, or it's illegal to make certain statements. They're banning Toni Morrison books, and this is one. I think it's unconstitutional. It's illegal. That's probably the most prominent thing that's actually happened on the policy side, and I'd say it's a direct result of uh, of the toxic discourse that it really played. It played in the Virginia governor's election. It really plays on the right, and it frankly caused me to step back from the conversation where in this past spring I was pretty open about concerns about what I would not really critical race theory, but DEI efforts, if they're done badly, being counterproductive to making progress. And I was pretty open about that. And that if I made those same statements today, or if you go back and read them, they would be read today like I'm inciting some nonsense. They're teaching CRT in the schools line.
I
And
mean,
so
I
it's
mean,
it's actually made it harder to have the conversation. I'd say it just sounds like you're all worked up and you're on like watching Fox News and getting angry.
well, let's actually kind of dig into the statement that um, DEI, if it's done poorly, is unproductive. For you, what is done poorly in the DEI space? Because I've been investigating this issue as well, and I do see that there's some problematic trainings out there. I'm not sure how these corporations or institutions are procuring these DEI specialists or whatever, but I mean, I'm sure that's part of the reason why there's some rotten fruit out there. So, but you probably have encountered some, right? Like, or at least have read probably about some or whatnot. So I want to know what you think is problematic DEI out there.
Yeah, so it's a big space and hard to characterize with broad strokes. And I do think there's some merit to individual anecdotes versus what's happening commonly in the country. We have to be careful about um, trying to understand it. It's not easy to do. So it in like the private schools in New York is an example where I've got 3 kids in private school in New York, and there have been some uh, there's been real pushback from the parents in certain schools where I think the head of school at Dalton or something left um, over those sort of issues
I
where
did follow
curriculum's
that whole
developed.
scandal. Yeah.
Yeah, and um, so some of that is about power structures in these schools. So these schools have been problematic for uh, for Black kids, and they have to make it better. So I think on one level they're acknowledging a responsibility and they know they have to do something, and then it's a question of how do they do it. And I think they're struggling with that, and in some levels they haven't thought it through to get it right. So like an example would be my high school. I went to a private high school where I grew up, very nice private school. It was not good. There were Black students who were totally comfortable, thrived socially, moved easily between the Black, student body and the full student body, and just were just socially superstars. And then there were other kids who like really only had Black friends and weren't, it didn't feel like belonging and inclusive to them, and they clearly didn't have a great experience, and the school needs to do better. But they formed like a faculty white affinity group in which the whites are supposed to get together and talk about like, learning about issues and having a group and talk. And it's not, the language and the verbiage of it is such that they're, anybody who's on remotely anything moderate to conservative in the faculty feels like they need to be quiet and not open about whatever their issues are or concerns, and it's elevating it in a way that's dividing people. I mean, sometimes it's racial segregation, right? Like you have affinity groups and things that I think are part of good DEI in terms of those can be positive solutions for students. Students find them valuable. They find the experience, valuable to have, but they can also be exclusionary, right? Like, if you're at a DEI event and somebody tells you you're going to go in breakout rooms and I'm told to go in the whites room to like talk to the whites about DEI, I don't like that.
Why not? Why not? What's your problem with that?
I would say, having a conversation with you about race is exchanging where you have a different perspective and something valued and I expect to learn something. I don't know, racially segregating people and asking them to talk in their own racial group as part of it. I would say sometimes not what I view as like exchanging things and creating a inclusive environment.
It sounds like you're saying you don't think you have anything to learn about race from other white people.
I wouldn't say nothing to learn, but maybe I'm not nothing to learn. Yeah, I don't know why you get that from what I said. Meaning
because
I'm
you
probably
said,
just saying I don't want an event to be segregated off into the white group as just a social experience. Like,
well, that's I don't think.
groups.
Yeah, I don't think it's not like an experiment. Like I think that people. Okay. I'm not saying that I would do it. First of all, I want to be clear about that. I wouldn't do it. Okay. If I were a DEI person and I was teaching people about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and I was running events, I would never do that. Okay. But I can see why someone would do it.
Sure.
And so you kind of didn't have anything in place for that reason. So I was trying to give you that reason, right? Which is that maybe I thought maybe your perception was that, because you mentioned like, well, I want to talk to you. You probably have a different perspective, right? But I'm like, wouldn't that happen if you were in a room with all white people too? Like it was almost like you were assuming that if you were in the room with all white people, that experience wouldn't happen. But like, so I was just pushing back on that implication. But I think the value of doing that is that probably part of the reason you feel uncomfortable, it's not just because it's segregation, right? I mean, like we live in a really segregated society, right? Like a hyper segregated society. That's where we live. It's also the fact that, nobody likes that, right? Nobody likes being grouped together with a group based on, nothing, which is exactly what you're doing when you're doing it on race. But like, that is Black people's regular experience. No matter what we do, someone's going to look at us and see us as Black as part of a group of Blacks.
Sure.
And sure. So, of course, white people are not used to that in general, right? Like it's not really you guys' experience. People are not putting you in a box of whites. And even if they are, it's not something that most white people think about almost ever. So part of putting you in that group is probably to get you to think about it, because the fact of the matter is there are white group dynamics in the country and white people largely ignore that reality. And so that is one reason why just keep putting you in the group is going to make you start thinking about that reality. And then secondly, people who have come to my open discussion group, a lot of white people who've come there have kind of said, I didn't really have an idea of what was going on until X, Y, and Z happened, or until I saw this, or until my girlfriend, who is black experienced this in front of me, or until I saw this video and it made me think about something that happened in my, to my black friend, or, whatever. Like, it's normally something, there's some trigger to getting people curious about this issue, because part of the problem of not moving the conversation forward is that white people in general, I hate generalizing, but I think it's appropriate in this situation, don't like talking about race, and they
Oh, sure.
and they don't have to talk about it, right? And it's uncomfortable for a lot of white people, and they can avoid it. And so it's, for black people, it's not the same, right? And for other people of color in general, it's not the same. We don't avoid it. We're not afraid of it. We talk about it, and we can do it differently. So having it all in one group sometimes can actually make a lot of white people feel even more uncomfortable, because they're in an environment where people have the vocabulary, right? The kind of understanding of the different narratives that exist within race, the understanding of like a lot of different historical facts that maybe, other people are not aware of, like the Tulsa race riots, right? That a lot of people became aware of because of a TV show, right? So I'm just giving you all that information just to try to put some nuance on the situation, and try to express that, like, it's not like a random segregation for segregation's sake, or to create some kind of hierarchy. It's actually responding to the fact that a hierarchy was already created and a division was already created, and that's our reality. And everyone needs to come to terms with that in order for us to actually move forward.
Yeah, so I agree with a lot of that, and I think this is one of the tensions when I think of, how does the country make progress? How do some of these things play out in like real communities? You know, Part of what you said, in my mind, categorizes as like, color blindness as a concept will get put forward by some people as, well, why shouldn't we just move on from race? Like Glenn Lowry will make that argument explicitly. Let's just move on. And I've never really agreed with that, because to me, it's just so manifest that people are racialized. Even you called it a made up thing. Like in one sense, it's entirely made up. In another sense, it's so very important to how people are treated in our society still that, for us to move on, maybe we first have to elevate race to deconstruct it. And so that basic move is, I think has a lot of logical appeal. And then against that, I'm like, it doesn't mean that anything in that direction is the way that we have to go. And so we can create more racial hostility and division through certain things. And then I don't know. I'm conflicted on this issue, I'll tell you, in that if,
let me say one thing that might help.
Please.
So you said, there are certain things that we could do that could create more racial division. Let me just say that every time we've ever made any racial progress, and I'm sure you know this, there has been a significant backlash, right? And a white lash, a lot of people call it, right? And that has always existed because there are so many people who don't want to go down this road. That's the reality of the situation.
And I don't think that's dispositive that then anything that elevates race is a productive move, which is not what you said, and a little bit.
Definitely not what I said.
It's
but
the content.
I guess, hang on. But my point is, anything we do is going to cause that backlash. Anything. It doesn't matter. I'm not saying that anything we do is going to be productive, but anything that we do is going to cause a backlash. So when you're evaluating the productivity of it, I guess my question to you would be, how are you evaluating that? Because again, like, you seem to have more fluency in these issues than most white people, I would say, because you've been investigating it, right? And you kind of have an interest in it. So you've been learning. But, I guess I always wonder, like, how do you evaluate that this is a good DI, this is a bad DI? Because when you were first talking about the segregation issue, it sounded like it was basically based off feelings.
Okay, so I'll give you the content I put on Twitter. So one, my point with that, on just to close out on that, was not that one, I totally agree that all, civil rights movement to today, to this thing that happened with state legislatures saying, basically, we can fire a teacher if they say America has a racist past. And it's absurd. It's like saying 2 + 2 is 4. You can't fire a teacher over it. It's chilling of speech. It's illegal. It's unconstitutional. So I agree with you on, progress has always come coupled with it, but there's also things that aren't progress. So to me, my point was, and you get it, but sometimes I think there can be a thought that things that cause backlash is a sign of progress. And sometimes no, it's just bad. Like it also can just be bad. So to me, it's just not a signal either way. Like the existence of backlash doesn't mean you're doing it wrong. It doesn't mean you're doing it right. It doesn't mean we're making progress. It doesn't mean we're going backwards. So, and I think
that's exactly my point, right? So
I think you and I agree.
We are agreeing on that. Yeah.
Yeah, but I would say there's probably people who disagree in multiple directions with that as well. But more content on like, because again, critical race theory. I think I first became aware of critical race theory after reading like Michelle Alexander's book on the incarceral state. Because I came at this issue. I'm libertarian. I came at this issue not from just an interest in race per se, but in criminal justice, which then just is inherent, just unavoidably in America about race. And a lot of the reforms just touch on race. So, so when critical race theory started to get used as a topic, it seemed reasonable to me in terms of the DEI efforts that were happening to broadly kind of sloppily label them critical race theory, even though it was inaccurate. And then that blew up into this totally unproductive, that's not being taught. And now we're talking about what words mean versus, stuff that's actually happening. So a DEI explicit thing I put on Twitter probably last spring was, my son's experience where, they played him like this New York Times clip of like, I don't know, 20-something, 30-something, 40-something white people talking about race very uncomfortably and awkwardly and saying like, am I racist? So if you Google like New York Times, white people talk about race, it's like a video thing they put up as part of their series. And it just wasn't, he didn't have the right context to process it, despite us talking about these issues in the home and him having, we've read, literature, which I think is a great way to get at these issues. Like one of the things he asked was, he's kind of like, is treating people as individuals a white idea? Like, why did they say that? And I said, that doesn't make any sense. I don't even like, it's just out of the blue. Like, what are you talking? Like, I don't even know what you're talking about. And he took me through it and I watched the clip and somebody said basically that colorblindness is always something that white people are talking about in the clip. And then I'm like, oh, now I know what that means. But he didn't have the context to process the statement. So when somebody said to him, the people who talk about colorblindness, it's always white people.
I mean,
right? You and I understand that.
They didn't go over. They didn't go over
that?
what colorblindness is with him.
It's just a guy on a video talking.
But wasn't this like in his class?
It was, yeah. No, they didn't give the context. No, definitely not.
Okay,
no.
Well, that's a teacher problem. That's an instruction problem because that's insane.
Sure. I mean, I think that's fair. Yeah. I mean, but in terms of the material and then the ability for the students to actually process and understand it. So like I actually did a series of talking to him and I wrote this on Twitter in the spring. Like I said, okay, well, let's just talk about this. Like when Barack Obama was elected president, did racism end in America? And he's like, no, I'm like, but if we can elect a black man, then there's not a problem. And so I'm explaining to me why that's wrong. I had him explain to me why that's wrong because it's silly. And I explained to him what colorblindness can be used. What does that mean if somebody says what the guy said? And had him explain to me why that's, I said, why don't we just stop talking about race? Wouldn't that just work? And why isn't that the best approach? And I had him explain to me, would that work or not? And he said, and he had a great answer because kids are smart. He's like, if it would work, that would be great, but it won't work. But if it would work, it would be great. But Dad, that can't work, right? Because it's for all the reasons it's an issue. And he doesn't know, like they're shocked. It's been interesting to have children in that they're shocked by certain facts. Like when my kid was 8, I had him predict, he knew how many presidents, he knew Obama was president. And I had him predict how many presidents were women and men in history. So he knew there were like, 44 presidents or whatever. And he said 16 women. That was his guess. It was a very sophisticated answer. Like he could divide by 2 already, and he knew like it wasn't 50-50. But, I told him it was 0, like the kid's jaw dropped. So it's interesting to have had kids to understand some of these issues through them. And also, I think that's part of, like, you talk about what can people do. Having these sort of conversations is one thing. There's probably nothing more important I'll do than raising my kids in terms of how they're actually going to behave to real people in their community. But yeah, I was disappointed with some of the DEI curriculum, and it's really hard though to have those conversations. Like, I don't want to be with the school, the parent who complained about the DEI curriculum. Like the last thing I would ever want to be. My God.
No. That's the first thing you should want to be, man.
Oh,
I mean,
absolutely
like,
not.
listen, you should have been in there teaching the class the way you were interacting with your son. Like, I mean, do you really think most parents are having those kinds of conversations with their kids? You're like getting 2 gold stars, sir. Like, I'd have you in the classroom, definitely having a conversation. Like, you are obviously more adept than than your child's instructor. So, like, I think that's blatantly clear from your story. And I think that that's where the problem lies, not with the curriculum, not with the video, but with the fact that, like, the issue you're bringing up, the fact that your kid couldn't connect to what was in the video, that's an instruction issue. Like, it falls squarely within the purview of the teacher. So maybe one of the real problems is that instructors are being given this curriculum without really understanding how to implement it themselves, which is another reason why we do need people who know how to teach these concepts, like yourself or others, to really get involved and step up to the plate and be that person and say, hey, like, this is what happened with my kid. He didn't really understand. And, we need teachers to be making that connection to the students if we really want, this new curriculum to have an impact and get people thinking about these issues and aware of them at a younger age and educated about them at a younger age. I don't think what's wrong with that?
I appreciate what you said. I would say, just being frank, like the actual being against, even because what that's saying is, I can just give you a concern that one would have, that I would specifically have about, pushing back on the curriculum, is that, one, a lot of these schools don't want the parents' input particularly, right? They want to run, they run their thing. They get such hostile, obnoxious feedback from the parents that there's not a lot of desire. Like, it's not parents can just be very obnoxious. And then separately, of the things I want the school to do, like things that are important to me, I'd like to know, because I think I can, help, and I want to be a part of it. I care about the issues, at home. So I'd love to be more involved and know the curriculum. I think the truth is, if they're really transparent about it, they get the white lash. It might be a very polite, respectful white lash. People can be crafty, but like, I think one of the things that schools have learned from the experience in New York and the private schools, and things like what happened at Dalton, the Grace Church example, what's happened is, I think people are concerned about a level of transparency with the parents will cause really impossible to manage backlash. I think that's a reality of it.
Yeah, I mean, the reality may be that that's what people are thinking, and you're probably right about that. But unfortunately, that's what you're signing up for when you decide to do something about this. And that's kind of what I was getting at before. A lot of people think that we can make the changes that are necessary to kind of cleanse the toxic racial environment that's been fostered for generations through all kinds of insane, dehumanizing practices and through the enforcement of unjust laws and practices, for generations, that we can somehow do that easily or without any kind of sacrifice. It's never going to happen. You have to, if you're going to step foot in these waters and you try to do it halfway, then all you're going to do is prop up the current system. So that fear.
I completely agree. And what I would say there is, when I say sometimes I think people haven't thought it through, I think it has never been more profitable socially in America, especially in elite coastal situation, where to speak out, as an anti-racist, to be on the side of making progress, to be seen as part of that, has never been more socially profitable. And it is not a surprise to me as a realist that Fortune 500 companies, elite universities and private schools, social leaders it's never been easier to speak out. And so more people will. But that's not the same as the hard thing you're talking about, the going all the way, the being willing to make sacrifices, to push through, to put yourself out there. And it's fair for you to criticize me and say, you should call up and tell them your view. If the curriculum's not good, you got to be part of making it work, make it better. That's a fair criticism, I think, of me. And I would just respond that, like, if you were the principal, and I don't know you well, but like, just from my interaction with you, it takes a level of trust to say to somebody, hey, I think this wasn't good. We should try to make this better. And then you have to have the trust the person's going to understand what you said, even if they disagree, understand you're trying to make it better. You're not calling up saying, can you please not talk about race with my children? Right? Because that's the last, like, the social penalty, and frankly, just the school not wanting to hear that. Like, I wouldn't want to be misheard that way even. I wouldn't want the school to hear from me that I'm against your curriculum, because it just couldn't be further from the truth, right? Like, I participate in all the things because I think it's, I want the Black kids that go to school with my kids when they're 10 years out and they're alumni to be like, yeah, there were issues, but I felt like I belonged there. That was a great experience for me. It didn't feel like I was going to a place where I was not the person who was supposed to be there. And that's how I think a decent number of people in my high school felt. And it's something we should change. And it's not easy, especially in some of these, institutions and there's issues of class too that are different but related to issues of race. And so it is important. People always say, do the work. And like, if people did as much work as the number of times I heard do the work, I think we might make more progress sometimes. But I don't know. Sometimes I come back to policy because I think it is so hard when it's in the community. Like you talked about the benefits of the in-person. There's also the fear of being honest. And the vast majority of white people just don't attend any of the DI events. And I think they're very transactional. I think they're transactional where they're like, what's my upside of speaking out on race? Like, what's my upside in having this conversation with you? And for me, the upside is if a million people do that, and a million people have, we're going to have, I think, a very interracial future as a country, like, where these things are going to have to happen. And it's just going to get us to a better society. And I'm going to feel better about me after this conversation with you. And I think I'll learn things. I already have. But I think it's your own self-respect to some level. Do you care enough? And so, some of this is my own psychology, I'm sure. But I think it's also the right way to be. People say virtue signaling. Like, am I virtue signaling by acting I'm this great actor on race and I want to talk about it and be honest and stuff? Fine. But like, there's also virtue. Like, actually,
I mean, I don't call that a virtue signal whatsoever. Like, I guess it's really hard for me to understand this position. I have to say, because I get that there's fear. Okay, I get it. Trust me. You don't start a show where you have conversations live about race in this environment without fear, right? So I understand it, but I don't know. Like, when I heard you talking about someone misinterpreting your words to believe that you don't want your son learning about race, it's hard for me to imagine that happening. I think that if it does happen, then that trust isn't there with the leadership of your school. That just sounds like a problem with the school and with the teacher. Like, a school is supposed to be a community partner. It's supposed to be fostering growth and learning. And so, like, if you feel like you can't even trust the school enough to communicate with them when your son's learning was hampered by the teacher's instructional practice, I mean, that's a red flag, right? Pretty big one.
Yeah, and I know the teacher, we have an open dialogue with them. I think I did mention it to the teacher. In truth, I didn't talk to going to the administrator with is like, we would never do that. I mean, just
I'm glad you talked to the teacher. I mean, was the teacher receptive to your concerns?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And but at the same time, I think they're in a tough spot where they're doing some of this curriculum and not really talking about it with the parent body in terms of what the curriculum is. And so I think they have their own, everybody has a boss. Like, they have their own concerns in terms of not wanting to get a foul on any of these issues either. So it's just touchy. People are touchy, and and I say chicken shit is like, And I am critical of that at times, and I try not to do that personally. But look, there's hostility, there's a real deficit of trust on these issues that I've experienced. When we were doing our pre-call, um, like there's times where it's very justified at times for people to have a distrust of white people on issues of race, and it can lead to rational, uncharitable expectations about how honest people are, what they really think. Um, and so it's hard to build that kind of trust.
You
I don't
know,
view it as a
let me
simple like they're
let me
just failing if there's not trust on these issues. Like it's more widespread that there's a trust deficit, I think, than just like one school's not doing a good job on one video or something. There's a trust is a major hurdle, um, for curriculum, for the parent responses, for all of these things.
let's
You see
dig.
it with like sex ed, like they're terrible. There's no trust in the schools in sex ed. People are like wildly hostile.
Okay, so yeah, I mean that makes a lot of sense. You know, I get that, and but isn't I mean the schools is like the best vehicle aside from like the church to get these messages across. I would say church is one, school is two. So
Well, let's talk about the public schools, because so far, I mean, it's just such a narrow slice, and I do think I don't want to be part of the problem in terms of taking these anecdotes from a few, private schools serving a very small segment of society, and not talk about the bigger issues that are happening in education. Like the private schools just don't matter very much. I think they matter for the journalists and for the media and some of these stories, and people like to talk about it. But the public school thing that's going on is much bigger. And on policy, I think my policy is not well liked by social justice minded people. But I hold it nonetheless, which is I really think school vouchers is an incredibly pro way to reduce the power of the state in the schools. So we talked about the state in terms of responsibility of the government in so many dimensions for historical and ongoing racism in America. Um, we have state-run schools. The states run the public schools, and I really wish they funded public education and didn't run the schools, because there would be some things that were toxic and go backwards. But I think overall, empowering parents to pick the schools would actually create much better diversity and ultimately, first of all, empower. It's from just a justice perspective, the fact that we fund things from property taxes at a local level is incredibly bad, certainly has disparate impact, and is part of furthering wealth inequality or racial inequality in the country. Like if you're a progressive and you're not for at least state level pooled funding of public school education, I mean, you're not trying, I think, to adjust to address the impacts of of legacy wealth inequality. There's
well,
a huge racial
I
wealth
think
gap
that
still.
that's exactly where a lot of people stand is that they're not trying and they don't want that.
They don't. I think that it to me, like, I mean, because I'm not a progressive, right? Like I'm a libertarian. So if we're going to label things, it's pretty easy to label. I would self-identify as libertarian. The but people who would be more of a progressive mindset, like if they're not for that, I think it's really tough. And but there's huge pushback against school vouchers, which is viewed as kind of a right wing, market fundamentalist kind of view. And I look at it as like, if you've got parents and you put the dollars in their hands, uh, I have a lot more faith in that than these school boards and frankly state legislatures. The state legislature, if you had school vouchers, the white lash that you're talking about would not be the same thing right now. We just couldn't, like, they don't control the curriculum. If they just send a check to every family who has kids, they send a voucher and they say, go pick your school. That's it. Are they going to cancel the school voucher program? Like the parents pick what school to send them to. And I would not want the state legislatures, especially in some of these red states, but frankly, in any of the states, I don't think the state legislature should control the curriculum at all.
Yeah, yeah, I hear you. I think that all that would happen in terms of, I think it would be a fake empowerment of parents because the parents are going to make the choice that they think is best, and all that'll happen is whoever has the most money to convince these parents about what's best, they're going to end up doing that. That's what we see. You know, we see in parent teacher conferences throughout the years talking to parents about choosing schools and picking between different options, they hear it through the grapevine through the same sources, right? And so all someone has to do is take control of those sources of information, and that's it. That's the end of that game. I just only say that because that may seem very like evil laboratory doctor esque, but that's actually the kind of thinking that some people employ at those top levels. So I just want to put that out there.
Yeah, so I'd say I probably just have more confidence in individual families on topics they care about. Like poll after poll shows that like, you know, Black families care about education every bit as much, and in a lot of polls, like more
Yeah, it has nothing to do with
than white
caring.
families. Yeah.
It has nothing to do with caring. You
Well,
know,
I trust people as consumer, meaning like if you pick what car to buy, I think you do a pretty, despite all the car companies wanting to get you to buy their car, I think you do a pretty good job buying the car that's right for you and don't get tricked.
it's
And on
just it's just
education, I think people would not get tricked.
it's
You
just
know,
impossible. It's just impossible when you're dealing with schools. You can't go visit every school and understand what the school is about. You can look at the curriculum, you can look at the records. Even me as a teacher who has worked at many different schools, um, even interviewing at the school, talking to the teachers there, the experience actually working there, you see the environment differently when everybody's there. Like, you could do that work, but I don't think a lot of parents would do that work. Given my judging from past experience, there's not a lot of parental involvement in the schools in general. Parental involvement has been declining for a long time. So I think that all those things need to be taken into account when you're thinking about what's going to be successful or not. The people who are deciding policy are looking at those things. So I hear you. I also agree with you about the legislature. I do think that the legislature state legislatures have a vice grip on public education, and not in a good way. And that a lot of reforms that could really improve student performance and give students more resources are not being able to be implemented because of the legislature. I actually think they're working fairly transparently at this point, against improving education. And I'm not sure why, and I'm not sure what people are waiting for, but I am working with an advocacy organization. I was just elected president of my community college's chapter of the American Association of University Professors. So I'm going to be advocating my state legislature here in North Carolina for the faculty, and for K through 12 instructors. But I also hope to investigate exactly the question that you brought up, which is like, is there a real way to kind of take some power over education out of the hands of the legislature? And at least in my state, I don't think there's really a pathway for that. I don't think school vouchers is one here, at least.
Yeah. So just on the first part of that, because I understand what you're saying in terms of there's the investment cost for one family to try to figure out the best school is such that there's like search costs or something that it's not feasible. We do manage it with a lot of other products and services, including very touchy things. Education's unique; nothing's the same as it, but it has worked pretty well in a lot of other very disparate products and services. The other thing is people do shop for public schools. It's the people who have the economic means to choose where they go live. They have more geographic mobility, and you look at it. If you try to predict where home prices sell, you need to know the school district. Very close neighborhoods. When people buy a home, and when people school district is one of the number one factors that professional home builders will look at as to where they're going to be able to sell a home. And so there is shopping going on. It's just very very much shopping that's happening among people who are buying new homes, who have geographic flexibility, who have means. They're shopping for their public schools, and they move into a school district where they get great score. They're usually scored by the states, et cetera. They have various public reporting systems on scoring schools. So I think there is a decent amount of shopping going on. It's just really unfair. And so under vouchers, look, would there be would some parents just be sending the kids to the closest school, send the kids to, the school where somebody sends them an ad or something? That would definitely, we see it with for-profit colleges. There's a lot of for-profit colleges that are kind of scams, right? So I would say I'm not dismissive of the concern that people will get scammed or the harm that does.
That's not really what I'm getting at.
Oh,
Is
so maybe I misunderstood. I thought you were saying like people will have a narrative of, you get people school vouchers, people are going to come in with ads and filters of information to get them to make a choice to drive them to certain. That's what I thought.
I mean, that will happen. That just always happens. But but no, that's not my point. My point is, there are all kinds of problems with public education right now, and school vouchers is not going to fix them. And so, like, just getting a student in a school is not going to solve the significant issues that exist in the public school system. So, like, when you're saying it empowers people and they get to choose, I'm not denying any of that. I'm not denying anything you said. I'm just saying that, like, the problems run so much deeper than being able to choose what school you go to, that, like, this is not, it's not a solution to what's going on. And what's going on is that, number one, the instruction is declining because they're not paying teachers, and they haven't been for a long time. And there's a generational turnover that's happening right now that is going to significantly impact the quality of teaching that is going to come up, because it's a huge sacrifice to become a teacher at this point. And that's like what the country has done. I don't think people get how much impact that's going to have on us. And it already has been happening through the years. It's just like now very severe because of how far they've taken it. So much.
Do you think that's a money? Do you think it's a money issue in terms of
I'm
99%
sure.
would we get a better? Go ahead.
I'm 99% sure it's a money issue why they haven't actually paid better. And number two, I think you were about to ask, like, do I think paying teachers better would improve the quality of instruction? I 100% absolutely do. And let me explain why. Because what's been happening is that teachers continue to get more and more and more responsibilities added to their job description over time. I've been a teacher for almost 16 years now, and my job has continuously just gained responsibilities through the years. I mean, we're talking writing curriculum, writing assessments, doing observations of other teachers, mentoring other teachers, cleaning up, being a coach or a head of a club, grading all the papers, inputting all the grades, communicating with, 100 and something parents, like that's the job. And it's ridiculous. It's impossible to do the job as it's been laid out at this point. It's just not possible to do it well. And so everyone does what they can. And, that's kind of like the cheerleading rah, 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 like that we put out there is like, oh, we're all doing the best that we can and we're trying to get it done. But like really what they've done is just like created an impossible job because they're trying to fit our job into a box that is not even what the students need anymore curriculum wise. So that's like what teachers are dealing with right now. And that's like one of the biggest problems. And then add on to that, right, that teachers get these advanced degrees. A lot of teachers have master's degrees and are required to get them to teach in the school system. Then they get paid a paltry amount compared to other people who get these advanced degrees. So it doesn't encourage people of color, for instance, to stay in the profession or go into the profession, because a lot of us need economic stability that we don't have a legacy of. And so we end up, it does give us like some start out stability, but then a lot of people leave because they're like, well, I can't really advance myself economically while I do. You're working all the time. You're working constantly day and night as a teacher, spending your own money, on kids all the time, as I'm sure you've seen. So it's just like, it's not conducive to building, wealth, which is a big focus of especially the Black community right now.
I don't. Most people not going into teaching for the money. I don't think that's the not a common not a common refrain
Yeah, but it
from
it should
teachers.
it should be something that people want to go into teaching for. I think that would definitely improve. Number one, the quality of candidates that we get, their kind of focus on their profession. Like a lot of teachers have two, three jobs. I did a catering gig last month, just to make some extra money. You
Yeah,
know,
there's cross sectional evidence. Yeah, I understand what you're saying, and um, there's some cross sectional evidence internationally. Like there's societies that pay teachers much higher amounts, and do have now some of that is maybe cultural values on education and other things, but they also have better outcomes and they have probably better teachers. Versus certainly they're just drawing from a bigger applicant pool. They can be more selective, paying more. The notion that if you pay more, you're going to have a better teaching workforce that's more attractive as a profession. That's just like basic economics to me.
Yeah,
It's got to be true.
exactly, exactly,
It's
and
got to be
like
true.
I don't think anyone would reasonably be pushed back against that. I don't think you really can. Like, I mean, what can you even say? But like, it's this
People would
country.
fight the unions. Well, what people would say is there's a cabal of unions working with the state to have these big pensions,
It's true.
and that
It's actually true, though.
and that like the cost is there's so many administrators and stuff, and it's the classroom. Nobody is going to attack the classroom teacher. But one, because I think it's just so intuitively wrong to people in terms of the burdens on the classroom teacher versus the thing. But they will attack the number of administrators, the overhead, the unions, the kind of public private bit. My point before, just because I should just clarify quickly, like I literally agree with what you said. Like the problems are much deeper. Just school vouchers isn't going to address things like what you talked about with attracting really talented, not just dedicated. We have talented and dedicated teachers, but more talented, more dedicated, even more attractive to people, right? Like I don't want to denigrate the current teacher population, but I think you're right that the other thing. My thing was really the pushback from the legislatures on this anti-CRT state legislature passing stuff. You would mitigate a problem like that under school vouchers, because school vouchers would come as a package with the state legislatures don't have the authority to do that. It's just they write checks, somebody else makes the decisions about how to run the schools, and the families get to decide. Now maybe they'd never do school vouchers where they actually let people send their kid to whatever school they wanted, because politicians, they're writing the checks, tend to interfere. So maybe it's not truly, it has to come as a package, but I viewed it as more responsive to that. Meaning, if you had a system where it wasn't just full state control of running the schools, issues like curriculum can get sorted out where we don't all buy the same color car. The notion that parents can decide where they want to send their kids. Again, it wouldn't, you'd have, you're in North Carolina. I've never lived in the South. Like my understanding of it is there'd be some parents who are pretty comfortable sending themselves to schools that I would find, morally reprehensible. So, you have to decide how far we're willing to fund that.
Well, I mean, that's why we have state standards, right? I mean, that's the
Totally.
reason why. So, yeah, it's a difficult problem. I don't think realistically we can ever wrest control of the school system from the legislature. I think, at least not in my state, but like maybe somewhere else. Here, I think what we need to do is put as much pressure on them as possible, because to me anyway, there's transparent corruption all over the place in the education system in the state. So, but okay, I definitely understand your perspective on it. I basically agree, that there are problems, but I just don't see school vouchers as a solution to any problem. I see it being a step that could be easily undermined. I see it as the choice that it implicates for parents could be easily undermined. You said that someone besides the legislature would be in charge of distributing the funds. Well, who would that be, right? And who gets to decide? I
No,
mean,
not distributed. Meaning they would write the checks, but then picking the school is at the household level, at the parent level, where you know they're able to pick the school. I mean, it does address the funding issue. They have these. Most states have passed some law now that purports to equilibrate funding between poor areas and rich areas based on property taxes, and it's really they don't follow it in a lot of cases. And so, but it sounds good. You can run in an election on saying that you passed a law that's now going to equilibrate state funding. But if you look at the funding of the schools, it's not equal even after they pass those laws. So, I mean, I do think there's problems of us getting, for want of a better word, lied to, meaning the politicians saying they're going to solve climate change, saying they're going to solve education funding. That sometimes is good enough for the election and not good enough for enacting change.
Yeah, I think oftentimes, and it's a huge problem right now. So I definitely think we need politicians who actually care about the issues. But obviously, I just feel like at this point, there's so many politicians who are obviously prioritizing stuff that has nothing to do with their constituents. And I mean, we can just watch that happen pretty easily at this point. It's basically we're watching theater 24/7 with our political system, both statewide and federally. So that's the government that we have right now. That's what we've created. I definitely don't think it's reasonable to think that we can wrest control over something like the public school system from a government that exists like that. Because how did we get to this place? You know, like we're in a very bad place politically. And education is in a very precarious situation. So I don't know, you know, like I feel like if it was as simple as like having school vouchers, that would probably have already happened by now. Number one, but like,
Well, they don't give up power easily. So,
right, like I mean, I don't see what incentive they have to give it up.
well, but that's why I think school vouchers is so hard to pass. It really, I mean, it has been uh, for such a thing that like it's actually progressive in the sense of in terms of like where the money goes. So often, I think our government redistributes money from you know lower middle class people to rich people, right? And rich friends of mine don't agree with that a lot of times. But if you say to them, okay, but you run a whatever financial firm that has billions of dollars investments from state pensions or from endowments that exist under law, you wouldn't have these $40 billion things if there wasn't a law that created them and a set of policies that let them invest in you, right? Like the aggregations of capital, the fact that New York is where the capital of the whole country runs through is very much a function of law. The Federal Reserve, the one permanent board member from the Fed governors is the head of the New York Fed, right? The SEC was created by somebody from Wall Street went and was the first head of the SEC. It was JFK's father. Like we have a significant amount of capture of the government, and the government does tend, I think you said when we were talking the thing, like that the government is probably the most responsible entity in society for ongoing problems of injustice. It's also something that has tended not to redistribute money down. Like the checks, frankly, the last year is probably the first time I've really thought that in a significant way there was some redistribution of like actually sending people cash, but it was still a pretty small percentage of what was spent. A lot of that money is going to people who own firms, right? Like the PPIP thing they did with the rescue. There's a lot of redistribution that happens through government largesse where it does really benefit the wealthy, and kind of does it in a way where they're pretty. You talked about white people are uncomfortable talking about race. Like rich people are often uncomfortable talking about how much money the government redistributes to rich people. They're very blind to it.
Yeah, being willfully blind, I think, is necessary when you have to, if you're going to make the argument that like people need to, I don't know, not get handouts or whatever, right? And then you're getting all these handouts from the government meanwhile and making all this money through government legal enforcement. You have to be willfully blind, I guess, to continue that hypocrisy, and to live that hypocrisy. And you're right. It very much mirrors the same kind of willful blindness that people have on issues of race, where they don't have to see it. It's uncomfortable for them to see it, for them to talk about it. And so they just don't, and they live their life like that. Rich people don't need to talk to anyone about how they make their money, right? They just need to make it. So, yeah, I do see that parallel very clearly.
The yeah, I mean, one of the things I think we were going to talk about is how, my views are just the white community processing race and the racial discussion. And you've spent a lot of time talking to white people about race. So I know, I have friends who express frustration that they have the same conversation over and over with different people. It's annoying. One of the things I think I have a little access to from just my upbringing, like my extended family is very, not like nuts right wing, but they voted for Trump. Like, my dad was anti-Trump, but like his brothers and sisters were all, some of them are, cops, ex-cops. Their kids are pretty right wing, and they all kind of supported Trump, which was wild to me because like these are not unintelligent people. Like they're not. I would have thought they'd see him from miles away as this like lying guy coming to them, lying to them. Like he's plainly lying to them. Like they don't like being lied to. These are, decent, honest people. Like don't like being lied to, and he's lying to them. And they just concluded he wasn't lying to them. And it part of it's not living, in the city where I grew up and stuff. And so like, being on the coast and looking back, like it seemed like a religion or like a craze. And it really did force me to reevaluate, the extent of some of the you can read about cognitive bias, but the Trump experience really hammered home like, wow, people really believe quite a lot if they're motivated to. But I also look at,
and that motivation, you got to think about what the origin of that motivation was to believe him. And I don't think anyone could separate that motivation from the issue of race.
yeah, it wasn't chiefly, so there was a lot of anti-immigrant sentiment too, which is
Oh yeah,
broadly in the race
I
category, but
include
not
that
like
in
black
it.
race.
Hmm.
Yeah, yeah. So that was prominent. And I'd say that was even more prominent than white black racial divide. So race problem in America. But there's huge grievance, like the level of victimhood that's felt. I'm like, you're like an upper middle class, like, insulation salesman who's retired, and like you have massive grievance over affirmative action. Like, how did it even affect you? Like, I don't even. It's weird to me because I'm like, you go to Cardinals games, like from St. Louis, like you go to Cardinals games and like cheer and drink beer and have barbecue. Like, why is this a big issue for you? Like, it wasn't like your kid was, supposed to go to Harvard and like didn't get in because of affirmative action and you have a grievance or something. Like, I don't know. Even that's a little like nobody's entitled to go to Harvard or something. But it is weird to me how big but the grievance is very real. And and also the messaging from the left, there's no inroads. And like some people would say, those people are just epistemically closed. They're just not going to listen. Like, don't talk to me about how to talk to your uncle. Your uncle's not going to listen. I'm not trying to win your uncle. I'm trying to win people who are persuadable. He's not persuadable. I don't really like. I lived with these people. Like, they're not. They are epistemically closed on things like when Trump happens, etc. But they really are. They're the I'm not a racist. They really don't want to think of themselves as racist.
Yeah, no,
They really don't
I
want to
get
be on the
that.
wrong side of it. They
Yeah,
don't
but
want to be.
I mean, there's so many videos out there at this point of people who are so obviously racist and saying racist things, then saying that they're not racist. Like nobody wants to think of themselves as racist, right? Like it's not a comfortable thing. I've done things that are racist before, but I'm comfortable admitting it because I know I know if it happens. Like it just doesn't bother me because I know that it's not like you get branded, even though that's how like a lot of I think white people imagine it, but like it's not like that. Like we're all human beings living in a society that has been racialized. And again, it goes back to acceptance of that. Black people could accept it a lot more, I feel like, because we have to. But white people don't have to, and I think it makes it harder for them to accept that that's just the world that we live in and shit like that is going to happen. Like this is where we are, and I think that a lot of white people want to live in a fantasy world because they've created that world and they can live there and they can keep most everything out if they choose. But that's starting to change, as the country diversifies, and that's what I think the conflict is that we're seeing.
Yeah, so I'm familiar with this perspective from just reading on the issue, and it's a common viewpoint of the sort of Ta-Nehisi Coates is very eloquent in making a very similar type argument of Fantasyland. The fake dream, the invention of whiteness as a thing to create this Fantasyland idea, and I think it's a very fair description of reality. I think it's really, really ineffective messaging. So like if I went and talked to my uncle and I said, oh, obviously race is a social construct, because it obviously is a social construct. It once you understand it, it's obviously true. I mean, the level at which that would be rejected, as it would be as if I had morphed into Nancy Pelosi in his home and was like just spouting drivel at him. He would just view it as, what are you talking about? Obviously, race is a real thing. And I'd say, what do you mean by real thing? And it just, the way people hear certain statements, right? Like if I said, well, look, like, told my uncle, hey, like, I think it's important that we use people's preferred pronouns because it's, there's certain heteronormative practices that are embedded in the language that, like, moving on from that's important to be respectful. He wouldn't even know what I had said. He would just be like, I don't like, literally, you just said some leftist drivel and I don't like it. And like, I'm not happy that you said this. He'd be like, let's, have a beer. Like, I don't want to talk about this. And so I think sometimes people actually have trouble understanding the concepts and don't understand. And then when they're stubborn, benefit from the status quo, and refuse to understand, they get characterized as they don't want to understand. But sometimes they also just don't understand. And the language is sometimes, it matters how far you go. There's examples of the language just being like, and I think there's ways to communicate with, the I'm not a racist in a way that really, like, that's like the whitewashing of Martin Luther King is a great example of this, right? Like Martin Luther King said, we should stop talking about color, right? Like that's become almost, I hear more now that how ridiculous that is than people actually even making that argument anymore. But it certainly exists on Twitter where everybody claims Martin Luther King. That's a good thing on one level. It's also very disappointing in that, like, wow, the barriers here to understanding are really strong. But I tend to look at that situation and say, okay, if we've won, because it's not the case that everybody doesn't want to be a racist. There are troglodyte racists who will tell you they're racist. They're just a tiny, completely ostracized minority at this point. Although Trump brought them out.
I have to push.
Numbers.
I have to push back on that.
Okay, but there's the out and out overt racists do exist.
Yeah, but like exist. they're not necessarily ostracized, because there's more of them than you think, probably, who get together and they talk about being racist. Like they're not the people you hang out with, obviously, but like I'm telling you, man, they're out there. They're not like a tiny minority. It's not like that, and I think it's important to know that. Like, I don't think that you could get knowledge of how many racists are out there. Like, I just don't think that you have access to that. Being where you live, being the kind of life that you're living. I think you should be very hesitant to say something like that. I would just encourage you to.
Okay, so maybe just clarify. The notion that there's lots of people who are racist is one thing. Like, I would describe the I'm not a racist people as lots of them are obviously racist. That I wasn't talking about that. I'm saying the overtly self-declared, self-described, happily avowed racist or avowed white supremacist, frankly.
I'm always curious about why people draw these lines. Like, what's the point of drawing that line?
What's the point of drawing that line? Well, it's the difference between saying there's people who hold what are socially noxious views, but will tell you they do. And there's people who kind of hold those views, but like to think they don't. And I think, one group you should be able to identify because they just tell it to you. And then the other group, I think to your point, I would say you don't know how big it is, but like when I say I use the word troglodyte racist or whatever, like use it as avowed is maybe the better thing. The avowed people should kind of be easier to identify because they tell you.
Yeah, but I guess I don't understand this whole point. Like why are you delineating these two groups?
Well, I was going to say you jumped in and said there's not very few of them. I mean,
okay. No, I understand what you mean now. I'm clear on that, but now I'm just confused about why we're talking about it at all.
Well, I was going to say I don't think I said why. Like what I was going to say was there's these people that are I don't know what the term is or whatever, but like run of the mill racist or something, like who will say I'm not a racist and they hold views that are like properly, easily pretty described as racist. And then there's some other group that I don't think is the main issue, which is like the avowed, well, anyway, the reason I was bringing it up was to say that the fact that the avowed, white supremacist is a socially ostracized group. So you can disagree, that's fine, but you jumped in at that point. What I was going to say was the fact that that group is ostracized is actually one of the most powerful forces we have to take the people in the I'm not a racist group and work with them. And I think people are moving to a much more liberal view, a much more pluralist view on and sort of empathetic view on race, because it's socially profitable for them to do so. I think the ostracism is really productive of the real extreme, and that if we treat the two groups the same, I think it creates it's a bad move. Like, it will be less productive in terms of moving people in a good, towards a more tolerant, empathetic position. That was the point. The point was that, like, I view the ostracism of the extreme, avowed white supremacist, whatever you want to call it, like white national, the people who like put up and post and send around like obviously toxic, socially unacceptable things. They have been socially punished and socially ostracized. And sometimes people talk like we should just tolerate everything, and nobody can be deplatformed, nobody can be socially punished or fired for their job for what they say. And I don't agree with that. I actually think it's like one of the most powerful tools, but I think it's a really dangerous tool. It's a potent, dangerous tool. And if you start crushing like the sympathetic middle of the road people who like if my uncle gets fired because he's like, says a racist joke, that's probably not as good because there's so many of them. And they're actually people that, one, some of them are too old, you can't work with them, but their kids are very winnable. And I think part of the progress. So that's the group that has to be won over for there to be progress, is the people who don't want to think of themselves as a racist. Like, even if they're really stubborn and it's really frustrating that they won't think about it, I kind of am like, that's the wood to chop. And tarring them, putting them in with, what I would view as the avowed racist, more extreme thing, I don't think is good strategy.
Okay, I understand. I think I understand now your perspective. Like, what I would say to that is, I think you're looking at it from a very specific vantage point here. Like, sure. If you're looking at it from someone who's trying to improve the situation, like myself, I'm not separating people out into those groups, like, because there's no point. Like, you can talk about race by talking about the reality of like what is. You don't have to like put stuff on people to talk about it, like you have to be talking about individual people in order to talk about these issues. Unfortunately, a lot of people, when you start talking about race, they just take it personally. They think you are talking about them. A lot of my black friends, like, we talk about this, is that when we have conversations, we'll be talking with people about race, and you can even see it reflected on social media as well. And the person, it's obvious in the response that the person thought it was a personal attack against them, when that was nobody's intention, because that's how fragile they are. And then the response to that is always, we need to be very aware of and, I can't think of the word right now because I'm really tired, but take care with that fragility if we want to make progress. And yeah, like, while I understand that, obviously, I'm doing this show, I'm trying to create a safe space for people, and I agree. But ultimately, that fear and that stubbornness is like at a pathological level. Like, it's not something that any like creation of a space or a program or an opportunity can really deal with. It's internal. It's something that people need to deal with internally. And the most we can do is be a catalyst for that internal change. But like, and if your argument is that like some of these programs are not the best catalysts, I would say that like, in my experience, the catalyst is really varied. All it takes is, just like in learning in math in a classroom, all it takes is hearing one thing and understanding it sometimes. And all of a sudden you get a flood of cascading understandings. That's how a lot of people learn about all kinds of things. And I think that happens in the race context too. But to get past the mental barriers that exist and people's closed hearts that exist, that's internal work. It'll never happen from the outside in.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think, touches on some of the, look, there does need to be a catalyst. I don't think that there's one like canonical path for like how to take a person who's closed to these ideas and move them. I don't, and I don't have a lot of experience in terms of doing that work either. So I think there is a certain level of like, I'm interested in it. And when I'm interested in something, I naturally, conjecturally kind of think like,
I do have a lot of experience. Can I tell you some things that I've learned then?
Yeah, I mean, I'm interested in the topic. So in terms of, because one of the things you talked about that I'd love to hear about is empathy. And I think there's different views in the social justice movement about how productive empathy can be. So like a very principled view historically that gets associated with the civil rights movement is that by calling out and opposing injustice, you build a broad movement and you move hearts and minds. And then there's other people who are very openly critical of that and say, no, it's way more entrenched and empathy won't, you're not just appealing to people's empathy. They're too close to it. And we actually have to elevate and put in people's face and then deconstruct the concept of race. And sometimes empathy and sort of elevation and deconstruction are put at opposites. And I think you're in a different position where you don't view those as oppositional. So I'm interested in your view as to the pathways from, my uncle, I'm not and he's not like some horrible guy or something. It's just like, but I think you and I would not view it as a close call in terms of holding racist views. And not behaving bad. Like he's not going out like behaving in some racially horrible way or something. Not at all. But like if you just sat down and talked and said, even like, what do you find that's funny? It would be like, no, that's just, no, you should not think that's funny. That's not a funny joke. That's a racist joke. Like, no. So there's people like that. What do you think are some of the ways that getting through to them ends up working?
For the person you just described, I wouldn't expect to get through to that person. Get through to them? What do you mean get through to them? Like, I mean, I don't know what get through to them means, like in that context, because do you mean convince them that they shouldn't laugh at a racist joke? Like, I mean, I don't think I can do that for anyone. Do you think convince them that they should be supporting anti-racist efforts? Well,
that would be good.
If they already don't believe, probably someone like your uncle doesn't believe that racism even is a problem. Would I be correct in saying that?
I think that there would be a political view to push back on the notion that racism is as big a problem as people have. But no, he would say racism's a problem. It's a problem. We all need to do better. It's a problem. We all need to do better. It's a segregated society. It's terrible. We need to work on it. It's a problem. But systemic racism, what does that mean? I don't know that there'd be a distinction between. I haven't had that conversation with him, but it wouldn't be shocked if there was a denial that like the police department has a systemic racism problem, where I'm like, that's just nuts. But I think he would not want the police department attacked, for example.
Yeah, I mean, I totally have met people like that, and again, I think that those are people that I wouldn't be trying to convince of anything because, they're people who are entrenched in their views. Like their priority is protecting the police. It's not about, making the racial environment better. Even though people say that they want to do better, oftentimes that's not what's in their heart. They're just saying it almost like, going to church and like reading the words in the Bible and then doing whatever, I mean, I've encountered that with people I've directly worked with this show and all kinds of other endeavors regarding race. Like there's a line that once people get to it, they're surprised at their own self that they won't cross it, even though they know it's the thing that they should do and the thing that they said that they would do. So I think that when people are talking about how deep it goes, it's because a lot of Black people have experienced seeing that and experiencing it. We're in a better position to experience that line and what happens at that line. Will people have your back? Will people listen to you? Like, for instance, in my poem on my YouTube channel, Contraband of Race War, I talk about a friend of mine who I think, let me see if I can remember the actual words right now. I was perplexed when a friend of mine of many years came to deny every instance of racism that I decried with, there's always a possible alternative explanation. It doesn't always have to lead back to the plantation. But often it did, so I started staying quiet. Until one day, a woman of many years old looked at me with a look so cold, something like that. I don't know. But anyway, this woman, long story short, I'll just tell you the story since I can't remember the poem right now. But
Sure.
We were getting on a bus in New York City. This happened in New York City. And a woman just looked at me. Now, I could tell from that woman's look that she was looking at me with hatred because I was a black person, just from the way she was looking at me. Now, this friend I was with is someone who, I tried telling her stories about other things that had happened to me that were much more blatant, that she always could find this alternative explanation for, and she would seek that out, and disagree with me every single time. But when she saw this lady look at me, she knew immediately what that look was about. She also knew immediately. This woman never said anything. She just looked at me. And so this is the kind of situation that occurs, like, for whatever reason, that scenario triggered her to see it, right? I'll give you another example. I know a lot of lawyers from going to law school, and there was a prosecutor who was a mentor of mine, white woman, and she mentioned that she was coming home and there was a police investigation going on her street. And she lives on a street with mostly black people. And she noticed that a cop, one of the police officers who was investigating, bypassed all the black people and went straight to her to try to get her statement. And she just couldn't think of an alternative reason why that would happen. And that's why it stood out for her, because she was like, is that what people mean when, for her, that was something that was so visually obvious, the distance away that she was, how many other people were there, the fact that she arrived late and wasn't even there at the time. She was just going through all the different things because she's a prosecutor, right? So she had that knowledge of the law and investigations and whatnot. So she was just like, well, is that what happened there? Right. So there's this, there is a perception difference because of our hierarchical positions in this, this artificially created racial dynamic.
Yeah, I think it's, I don't have the ability to experience being black in America. So you have access it through, talking to people. The statistics are, you do have to have a certain amount of mental front to try to explain away every instance of somebody personally reporting racism. That's kind of wild, I would say.
But people, this is commonplace though. It's commonplace for people to do that. Black people experience white people doing that all the time. We share stories with each other. It's a common thing. That's why I'm saying it's not like a niche thing. It's pervasive. So anyway, I just want to put that out there.
Yeah, people's mental defenses. I have, and it's hard to even see in yourself, right? There's certainly ways about myself that I don't have access to that I can't understand, right? And then there's things you can try. It's easier to see in other people. Something like that is so blatantly a defense or concoction. And I've been surprised. The Trump thing was eye-opening to me. I predicted the guy wouldn't win a single Republican primary. And I haven't made a political prediction since, because wow, I'm not I'm not super humble, but when I'm that wrong, I do shut up.
Did you see the who was it? It was Dave Chappelle, I think, and Chris Rock, the skit where they're in the apartment,
And Sarah Live, yeah.
Yeah, so I was literally living that. I remember the night that Trump won, I got 3 emails between midnight and 3 a.m. that night from people who I had spoken to, warning about what was about to happen to us for months, and just they couldn't, they obviously didn't believe me before, but after Trump won, they were okay, we're ready to kind of listen more, but Even those realizations, if people don't actually follow through and educate themselves and open themselves up to the possibility that they could be wrong about something significant and widespread and drastic that's right in front of their face and they didn't even realize it, to come to that kind of conclusion. Like some people can admit that. Like if when I'm very wrong personally, in my math classes, like I'll highlight my errors to the
Sure.
students to make sure that they understand that like anyone can make an error, but it's all about whether you can catch your error and whether you try to become better, right? Like whether you're trying to make sure that you don't continue to make the same errors over again, that you learn from your errors, right? And become more knowledgeable and stronger. And so that's why I highlight my errors. But what I find in the race context is oftentimes when someone is maybe sometimes even forcibly like learned of something regarding race that they were ignorant of before, um, there's just more barriers that kind of come up. Like for instance, I remember talking to an old high school friend of mine when I moved back here to North Carolina, and we were walking together, and he said that statement that you said earlier, which is that I'll never know what it's like to be a black man in America. And my response to him, because he was using that statement like a shield, you know, like as in like I'll never know, so I'm not going to try to know.
Mm,
And so
mm.
so what I and I've had that happen to me many times. So this time I decided to push back to him. I said, well, you can try. You can try to know. I think that you can learn a lot about our experience if you decide to learn. I don't think that anyone's experience is as off limits as people like to pretend. The problem is that our experience has been invalidated to the point of dismissal. And so that's part of the issue, a big part.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, for me, with my kids, like the arts is it can be a very powerful, like I read during the pandemic, we read Richard Wright's Black Boy, his autobiography. And which, they're probably not age appropriate, right? Like they're like 10 and 11 at the time. And that's got some really rough stuff, but like they're, I can see it already. Like they're at the age where they kind of want to know what team they're on. And that is where, you know, the society is going to racialize everyone, right?
I mean,
Including
it's
like,
already racial. It is always
of course,
racialized everyone. Yeah.
exactly. No, and then you touched on that earlier, like the way I'm racialized as a white person, for the vast majority of my life, like it's not like I didn't know I was white. Like it pissed me off in one of this New York Times thing. Like they had people be like, I don't think of myself as white, and I'm like, oh my God,
But it's
like it's
true of
just
a
so
lot of people. You'd be
obnoxious.
surprised, my man.
I know, but I don't. I mean, it just takes so much. I just them showing that to like an 11-year-old as a thing without context. I was just like, am I a racist? I hope not, but maybe I am. Except, and they're just like musing out loud in the most like just idiotic way, and I was just, I didn't like it anyway. I didn't, because it was just seemed so like, what's the message here? Like, white people can't talk about race. That was manifest. They're uncomfortable. They're like want to do the good thing but don't know. And like one guy said, I'm white and male, so I'm bad on both counts. I'm just like, this is not helpful. Like these are like people who need therapy or something. Like, and I do think you're right that white guilt and fear of guilt, like that the like I don't want to feel like I'm to blame for it, is a very powerful motivator. Um, I thought like on the political topic, I was didn't think Obama would win in '08 because I thought people would lie in the polls and would want to say that they would vote for Obama, but then wouldn't on race. And then he hit the poll number right on. And then that did, when Trump came in, there were people who were going to vote for him who didn't want to admit they were going to. I think that asymmetry is very interesting. It wasn't that people said they were going to vote for Obama, but then when it came in there, like, I'm not voting for him, I'm not comfortable with him. The polls on Obama were accurate. It's the other way that it manifested. It's people who were going to vote for Trump but didn't want to admit it. And it's very telling to me, that asymmetry, because I would have thought that was symmetric. Like, there's people who lie to pollsters, and there's people who are racist who lie to pollsters, and that's some chunk of the electorate, and maybe it's 4% or 5. I don't know. Like, I don't know why you even talk to a pollster, but if you're going to talk to them, why would you lie to them too? It's like beyond my conception of why you're wasting your time. Like, but I would think it would be symmetric. Like, people who don't want to think badly of themselves but behave differently than they say to the pollster. It should be the same number in both, and it really wasn't. It was interesting to me to think about that. Like the people who said they were going to vote for Obama did, and the people who said that they weren't going to vote for Trump, some of them didn't want to say it, but they were going to. And it gets to kind of that what you're talking about in terms of motivation. But yeah, I don't know how to, I don't have like I wouldn't, there was an interesting discussion on Twitter about, I think it was Hannah Nicole Jones talked about shame and guilt. And it really didn't break along typical tribal lines about, there were people even in the social justice movement disagreeing about how we should think about our country's history, because and to me, it's almost semantics. Like there's one level on which I'm ashamed of America's history. And there's another level on which I'm like, I wasn't around when the thing happened. I'm not responsible for what happened before I was born or something. Like I'm barely even responsible for so little of this world. Like, why would I feel ashamed about it? But then I'm also like, I like if America wins in the Olympics. I root for, the country. I identify with the country in some sense. I'm very critical of the government in a lot of ways, but like there is a sense in which we should be ashamed of the country's history. And there's a sense in which, of course, we're not responsible for it. But responsible for what we do now, obviously, which is really the point of CRT that's been so lost in the discussion about it. But it was interesting to me. It didn't break the shame guilt discussion. Really didn't play to type. I couldn't have predicted who was going to say what that day. Or often in Twitter is much more predictable.
Yeah, I mean, I'll give you my perspective on the shame or guilt thing. Like, I don't really understand it, to be honest. And I have investigated it with people on this show, but and there's some good conversations about that. One for patrons who want to go back and check, you can look at the conversation with Ben Seavey because we talked about that. But I don't know, man. Like, it feels weird to me to feel shame about a country. To me,
Sure.
I can't quite understand it. You know, yeah, I just don't get. Like, I can't even say any more than that because I don't even have a framework through which to like filter shame to connect to, like internal shame, country. I
Right.
can't.
Yeah.
Like
It's just too distant. Yeah. Too much of an abstraction, and you're just not responsible for it, or you didn't do it. Um, I think there's a lot of people who get a lot of self-identity from American, and it's frankly, I think some of the fight over the history. And I was very critical of parts of the 1619 project. Like I'm massively into the revolution, and I think the project there is incredibly important and good. And I think her lead essay that she ran the Pulitzer for was a fantastic personal essay. Like I've encouraged tons of Republican types to read it because I'm like, you should love this essay. It's like it's like a Black woman processing her relationship with her country in an incredibly patriotic way, in which she ultimately argues that Black Americans should be proud because they've made massive contributions to the improvement of America. Like that's the thesis statement of the essay is, I didn't understand my father having pride in this country that had done such bad things, and now I understand, and I want to tell the story in which Black Americans should be proud of all the great progress that we've built America, not just with our labor and physical creation, but like in terms of making it a better government, a better society. So like it's such a it's more patriotic than I am as an essay, and these like flag wearing types on the right tore her down just horribly. And it was really toxic when like you couldn't have a more patriotic type of essay in a way, and only the things that were negative about America's history were the highlights of where things got fought over. And I kind of understand the historians, and there's things that went into that, but yeah, it's if people can't, it's like look a gift horse in the mouth. Like what more positive message if you're like a super patriot and you think America's awesome, and somebody in the Black community wants to say that Black Americans should be incredibly proud of the role of Black Americans in creating the society. Like what's the better option than that? You just are like the mythology, you have to be full in on the 100% mythology. It's like an unreasonable ask. And I've looked at the backlash, like these state legislature things, not that I'm like completely blind to those those legislatures, because like I I've never lived in the South, like and it's not just South. There's also state legislatures in Wisconsin and other, they do nuts stuff. So it's not like I had some like positive view of state legislatures, but it's just so transparently ridiculous and illegal, and it hasn't been struck down yet. But there are people who I struggle to have access to it too, Will, where like I just don't. I'm critical enough of the country. Like James Baldwin was like, I love America more than any other country, but like, I also, part of why I criticize it so much, and that really resonates with me as a perspective on it. But there's people who get a lot of identity. I think it's a little bit. It does connect to the sort of white supremacist history of the country, where there were poor whites who voted for white politicians, and some of the value of the racial narrative was that, well, at least they weren't black. Like black people are lower than them, and so things like activism around voting their class interests were sort of superseded by the race issue in America, which was used very divisively. So I see some echoes of that in people defending today this like jingoistic America is the best narrative that's like looks silly if you don't have access to it ideologically, if it's not natural to you. It's not what you're taught.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely. It's funny because I guess what I was taught, or at least what I learned anyway, when I was a kid, was I learned about the struggle, but it wasn't in a negative way. I did learn about. Oh yeah, that's what I wanted to say. Sorry, I just remembered mid sentence. But because you characterized some of the stuff in American history as like the negative stuff, but like history is just history, right? There's the facts. I think we've gotten to the point where like we've narrowed this down to a pinprick at this point, where like people are like, we just don't want you to teach these facts, right? Like, I mean, I think we're pretty much there, right?
Yeah.
We're like, it's not even about a narrative or a characterization or anything. There are just some facts that people believe that we shouldn't be teaching, and some of the interviews with some of the parents who are up in arms at these school boards are revealing that, because they're being asked directly, like, so how do you think that we should teach this? And they're like, well, I don't even think that we should be teaching it. And it's stuff like the fact that Ruby Bridges had to have a U.S. Marshal escort to her first day of school.
Of course, yeah.
Stuff like that. So, they've been trying to. The United States has been trying to delete all the bad things it's done since it was founded, and they've done a really good job at it. There's never been any real accountability in this country for the atrocities that the government has propagated. There's no accountability whatsoever, and I think that we're seeing an unprecedented level of unaccountability right now.
Yeah, I've had the reparations discussion with some libertarians, and they really split on some of those ideas. Like there are people who really, can be, very open to the idea on the basis of the government did things and there's a tort, and they're open to. I think reparations is a good frame sometimes to talk about the issue, and there's people who are very closed-minded to it and view it as like they're personally being charged money as if they did something wrong. And I'm like, if the government goes and accidentally burns down your house, like they have to pay you for burning down your house. Like, and in some level, all of us as taxpayers pay, but nobody's saying we burned down that guy's house. They're just saying the government burned down the guy's house and do it. And there's a question of, there's practical issues involved, but like I've always viewed, I mean, at one point I think probably somewhat puckishly said, like, if any president could do reparations, it's probably Donald Trump. Because he's such a just nutcase in some level, but also it's the sort of thing that, like, if he thought it would serve him politically, he would do. Whereas both the mainstream parties just, I think, it's still outside the window of acceptable policy.
I mean, I think more importantly, like the United States government has kind of made it transparent they're not interested in reparations, like because of who they invited to their congressional hearing on it, because of the fact that they won't approve a bill to establish a committee to even study it.
Sure.
Like, I mean, I think the government has spoken, Yeah,
and I think we talked about this maybe in the pre-call, like where I think if you look out a decade or two, it will come into the conversation in a different way and
Yeah, you
become
did mention
feasible.
that. I remember that. Yeah.
And it's interesting. One of the ways I've framed my own thinking about progress in some of these issues is like, um, looking at what happened in the gay rights movement, where progress was slow for a long time and then felt very fast. And sometimes I'm hopeful that, like, when everybody has an interracial person in their family, are these conversations going to be easier? Because, like, it's one thing to kind of want to do the right thing and want to think positively of yourself, but like when you start to have nieces and nephews who are interracial, and then there's also just massive influence. Like, Hispanics are larger than the African American community in the country, which wasn't the case when I was a kid. And now you have huge influx of Asians, and that's driving up interracial marriage, which is not across the race problem in America is a white black problem at its core. So I'm not blind to that, um, but it just lessens how much that's the dominant political narrative in the country, or the only racial issue, when you start to have these other strands of different ancestry, different people, different cultures coming in, and they have different views on it too. Like, Hispanics can be very conservative as a group politically. So I don't know how that'll play out, but I've tended to be optimistic on kind of what I call the Bulworth future, right? Like, when everybody's got a niece or nephew who's like, it doesn't make sense. Like, we'll say half black. People use that phrase. Like, I hate using that language because it's so false to even talk about, to even say something like we call somebody half black is just, it's it's like almost buying into the ridiculous language. But whatever, people we racialize as black, and we racialize one of their parents as black and one as white. It's like the language is so not set up to be accurate on talking about it. But when people have people that are in their family, will it become better? Like, is that actually, because I think to some extent in the gay rights movement, the people who lived out and were willing to have their family, so many people then had people in their close circles who were openly gay, that it treating those people with dignity just kind of was like, the justice empathy bits became dominant and personal to people, so that the government didn't lead. Barack Obama ran on marriages between one man and one woman, right? Twice. That's embarrassing. It looks back, I think people would almost not believe it, that like that's where people were, but then it went very quickly. And so I don't know, like, can we go quickly on race once,
Nah.
once it's actually interracial, or
No.
it's too
I
nope.
think. I
Not
mean,
optimistic.
it's what I was saying before. I think in our earlier conversation, like, on the one hand, I do think you're right about the timeline being sped up. I do think that's happening in the race context as well. But do I think it'll end up turning out the same way that LGBTQ marriage rights did? No, because first of all, it was just about marriage, right? I think that's part of it. Secondly, there's no racial divide. There's gay people in every race and gender. And so I think that also helped speed things along. This divide is it is fear based the same way, but it's been reinforced in a way that discrimination against homosexuality, bisexuality, um, transgender people, even. Like, I feel like the history is just too radically different in terms of the powers that were gathered in order to dehumanize us and to make sure that we stayed on the bottom into perpetuity, like, as their ultimate goal. I think that it's just totally a different level, totally different dimension of problem that we're dealing with, I think. And as we kind of talked about earlier, there's a lot of internal damage that has been done to people that they're totally unaware of. And I think that until we are able to, like, deal with that reality and unravel it, then any macro ideas about changing the problem are going to run up against that barrier. And unless we're prepared for that, then I don't think any initiative is really going to be that successful. About what you said about people having, um, you know, for lack of a better way of saying it, mixed race people in their families and stuff. I do think that that has a huge impact. Like I said earlier, the number one thing that people report that has caused a change in their thinking is having someone who is a person of color in their family, join their
Right.
family.
Yep.
And I've heard people, several people throughout the years, tell me stories that they had racist views until someone of a different race came into their family. So it's a common refrain that I've heard through the years of having these types of conversations. So I do think that it makes a world of difference every single time. Um, what I also think is that um, a lot of white people have been telling me that, just like you said, you were surprised about Trump. I had a lot of people tell me that they were surprised looking around them at how many people seemed to support racism that they were unaware of, who had racist ideas. Um, and I think a lot of white people I talk to seem to think that they can easily identify racists, but I think that I don't know. I think that our differing perspectives on, I don't know, just encounter and experience and encountering race makes us kind of judge what's racist and not racist differently, or allows us to perceive, I guess you could say, the undercurrent of some kind of messages and implications a little bit better. And this is not universal or anything, but I do notice that there's a difference in perception of who and what is racist that is not just about definitions, and is not just, it's about perception. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that like some of those things are unsurprising to me on one level, and then on another level, like nobody wants to be told that they can't, call a spade or see something for what it is. But I don't
That's
know,
life,
like
baby.
across different worldviews, people can't do it. Like I don't know, like I experience. So I'm not in a, I'm in a not in a racial minority in a way where I would experience it in the race context, but I experience that same phenomenon in the political context because libertarians are a much smaller minority than black people. And so I constantly have that experience as a libertarian, that what seems plain and obvious to me to be a state problem or a state issue, my worldview, it is apparent to me every day the ways in which my worldview causes me to see situations totally differently. And maybe that might be something where it's not the same, right? Like you're not saying people just see it that way, it's their worldview. You're like, no, they're able to identify actual racial undercurrents and things. It's also right. I obviously feel I'm right on some of the intuition from seeing the state as sort of the cause of certain things, or seeing the power dynamic a certain way.
Yeah, I mean, this
Um,
applies across many different contexts. Like, it's not specific to the race context. I absolutely agree. That's why I think anyone can understand having specialized knowledge from a specific perspective and vantage point, right? Like, I mean, we have something called expertise too, right? Like, we have people who are actually working. Like, if you're actually working in the field as a doctor versus studying in medical school, like, the person who is working in the field as a doctor is going to have a completely different experience. It goes back to that,
I don't
same
think this is
idea.
a shared. I don't think people agree anymore. The criticism of experts. It seems like everybody can read 2 Wikipedia articles and have a couple memes and they think they're experts on stuff. So it's yeah. I mean, there's really low trust in institutions right now. Um, at the same time that like I don't know. I'd like to be optimistic on the path of like as like I'll just say as a white person, like I think about race way more in the last 5 years than I did in the 5 years before that or the 5 years before that for sure. And like I wasn't unaware, like I had really good history education both in high school and then took classes in college. So like, I wasn't like learning about Tulsa for the first time, watching The Watchmen or whatever. The so I had pretty good education. I was pretty aware and interested in the issue. And like, I mean, I forget when Michelle Alexander's book came out, but like my interest predates that. That wasn't like the first thing I read, but that's probably 10 years ago or something now. I lived in a very different place. So I'm thinking based on where I lived, like probably '09 or something. Um, but even that, like, it's just different now. It's a much more prominent part of the discourse. And I don't like it. Like, so it would be great if like, I want very much psychologically to believe that this is part of the good and is going to work, and it's going to be that when I'm an old man, like I feel better about this country and the experience for black people living here, and the just for everybody. Again, James Baldwin, like he's like, he's like, if white people want to save America, they need to save it for themselves too. Like there's not some future, right? Like I'm butchering his quote. I can't mimic the man.
I think you nailed the point though, which is that like we're all Americans here. We're all countrymen and countrywomen. We're all living here together, and so like you can't dismiss. It's dismissing our experience and the lives that we are living here in this country as something that we just have to grit and bear. It's an untenable situation that will lead to an unresolvable conflict, which we're already within. So, like, yeah, I mean, it's something that it's a perspective shift that a lot of people need to get of all races, which is that we're all Americans, we're all countrymen and women, and not all of us are treated the same or are given the same opportunities, given the same access to the promise of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness that we're all guaranteed. And so that's what we're working toward. And I think that you can have faith that what's happening right now, at least the fact that we're having more conversation and discourse, is going to move the ball forward because, frankly, that's the only place that we can start to make true improvement because there's too much knowledge that we haven't shared with each other across racial lines for too long. And now that we're breaking down some of those barriers and divides, that's going to open new throughways, new avenues to hopefully creating enough power to overcome those who want to keep us entrenched in a racial hierarchy. So that's the hope. We'll see what happens. We have a long road to go, probably, and so many other problems to deal with that are, existential crisis. So we'll see where things go. I don't think anyone can really reasonably predict the future at this point because we're all over the map at this point.
Yeah, it really is. It's easy to be negative, and so I think it's worth highlighting and elevating some of the things that are positive. Like one of the things that I take a lot of positive from was in the last election. You had Joe Biden and Donald Trump on the stage, both trying to take credit for criminal justice reform, right? And so that's just one part of the problem, but it's a big part. And that's so different than 25 years ago. Right? 25 years ago, it was like, no, I'll lock people up for more decades than you'll do, and you're just mandatory minimums, these things that did real harm to America, and also especially given drug prohibition, nonviolent offenders being locked up in the incarceral state is just it's not everything. Like the Black community is not defined by the incarceral state. It's I don't mean to characterize it that way. It's just like it does have a disparate impact, and it has been incredibly negative, and has been a huge problem. And I think that's a clear progress over 25 years that there's that political moment. Even somebody as nuts bad on so many other issues related to race as Trump was like trying to take credit for it, was kind of positive. And then I think I was most optimistic. It's funny, like sometimes when the nation gets most negative on race, I'm at my most optimistic. So like all these body camera images of police abuse, I had white friends who were just like appalled and saying how bad this was and how much worse. I'm like, worse than what? Like, you don't think this was going on worse before the guy had a body camera on him? Like, so I've wanted universal body cameras funded, and I'm kind of angry that we didn't get it done in 2020 because after George Floyd, that was also a really low moment for a lot of people on looking at race relations. And I was again kind of more optimistic than I was forced to be a little more optimistic because I saw a majority of Americans on board with police reform for the first time. Police are kind of, people get, and maybe it's a little bit my extended family or things that I'm colored, but like people get really prickly about defending the police. And I'm like, why? There's like terrible. So I've been out of step for a long time. And I finally had like significant parts of the conversation to the left of me on the police, like abolish the police. I'm like, I don't think we should abolish the police. I just want to like totally change them and strip them of QI and replace a lot of it with social work. But like, and I do want to take their money away for sure. So defund, I was fine with. I didn't think it was good messaging, but I'm personally would slash their budgets and slash their pensions, and kill the police benevolent associations, which are truly evil. But I was kind of optimistic because like that was a majority movement. Black Lives Matter is, even though it's all lives matter nonsense reaction, like Black Lives Matter was a pretty majority movement. And I'm disappointed it didn't lead to more policy change, but I was optimistic because of that.
Well, I mean, it's another one of those things that costs nothing. It costs you nothing really to plant your Black Lives Matter flag. I mean, the most that'll happen to you is like maybe a neighbor might have a problem with it or something, but like there's no cost to it, and you could say that you're supporting it, and you can do nothing. And so like, I think that's part of the reason these movements get so big is because people have no intention of actually getting involved like in a real way, because it costs. It costs. It costs every single person who tries to do something for real about this issue. And as soon as a lot of people see the cost, then they don't want to be involved. But a lot of people's hearts are telling them to be involved. And so they plant their flags. And that's where people are upset about performative actions, you know?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
We're just going to have to keep trying to build up people's hearts and get people a little more invested in doing something by getting them to see what a better world could look like, what the possibilities for the future are, if we take care of these issues now in the present. I'm hoping that people really do still want a better world for their kids and for their grandkids. But it seems like that kind of thought process, I think in general, has kind of started to fall by the wayside. And a lot of people are not thinking in that same vein anymore. It's something that I noticed over time kind of fading away. Like people weren't as concerned about, leaving the place better than they found it. They were more concerned about, their own well-being and their own situations, a lot more self-centeredness to an extreme. And I just kind of started noticing it in society, and and it was having an impact on my students as well, who would report that they felt neglected a lot. So I don't know. I think there's a lot of issues here. I think that it's really hard to predict how things are going. All we can do is the best that we can. And in this regard, in terms of race, I think the best thing that we can do right now is exactly what you and I have done tonight, which is communicate. That's what we need to do. We need to communicate more and try to overcome our fear of communicating. I'm not saying you have to start a Twitch channel like me or a YouTube channel or something, but try to talk to people within your circle about these issues. Like, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. You may end up creating a conflict between somebody you didn't know was racist or have racist beliefs. Doesn't mean that you have to get rid of them, but like you do have to decide after that, do you want to remain friends with that person? Is that person someone who can be, kind of ushered out of their racist beliefs? Are you okay with being friends with the racist? Are you okay with having racist people in your family? And the answer,
choice.
well, I mean, in terms of like,
Family.
inviting them in, inviting them into your home, inviting them to be with your kids, inviting them to spend time with them, and
Absolutely true.
that
That's
kind of
absolutely
thing, like, because the answer for a lot of people who I've talked to who have admitted to having racist people in their family is, yeah, that's just old Uncle Martin, that's just like, that's just grandpa, that's just, this guy or that guy. And I'm like, yeah, but you're accepting it. This is how it goes. It's like, if you accept it, you accept it. If you don't want to talk about it, you're accepting it because you don't want to start a conflict. That's how it works. And it's unfortunate, but like, that's reality. I don't think there's any way around it, and people try to get around it all the time.
Yeah. Those are tough decisions, and I think withholding your participation from people can be a powerful tool, especially with family. And I had that experience with my father. My father can be very pro-justice, empathetic, and he could also be very racist. And I had massive conflicts with him when I was a teenager. I mean, 2 longer than 6-month periods where he wouldn't speak to me because I would leave the room if he said things that were racist, and he felt like I was trying to control his speech, and was felt
Wow.
like I was not being deferential. You know, it was
We missed the boat
big
talking about
fights.
that.
Yeah, big fights. I mean, and I don't want to tar my dad, like, it's not trying to insult. He's passed away.
I don't think you're insult.
But those are
You're just
real fights,
yeah.
real
You're just
fights over.
reporting, right? See, like why does that have to be characterized as insulting someone? You weren't insulting him. You were just characterized. You were just telling me your experience. I wouldn't have even interpreted that as an insult. You're just telling what happened. That's all you did right there. But in your
But not
mind, you
his
think,
best self. No, not his best self. Like in terms of remembering my father, those are the parts of him that are part of it. Like you said, history is not good or bad, right? They're just factual. That's true. But then there's also like, you know, you kind of want to have sometimes a positive image of people, especially, we have, two parents. Like it's just, um, they're meaningful people to you where like, uh, and those are painful memories and were difficult experiences, frankly. Um, but it's interesting because like the word anti-racist, like I would have said when I was in college, like the core concept of anti-racism, I fully embraced and felt like I had lived, frankly, at real personal cost. Um, and to see it now, that idea has really caught fire, and I think it's a very persuasive idea that people have a responsibility to do stuff, and it's causing action. And then it also gets appropriated and can cause some other grifting and stuff that's every manner. It's humans, right? Like they do every manner of thing with stuff.
well, Silent Cow, it's been absolutely wonderful talking to you tonight, man. Um, you've got such a great head on your shoulders. You're a really good thinker, um, and you've got a great heart, man. I think you're doing the right things. I'm glad that you're teaching your kids about race, even if the school may not be doing the best job. I'm glad that you are open to anti-racism, in general. I think that you don't need to be scared about criticizing anti-racism efforts, but you do need to be humble about it. And you do need to make sure that your criticism is valid. Um, and you might need a check on that. And if you ever do, I'm here for you, brother.
Yeah, really appreciate it, Will. Enjoyed the conversation, and I think it's very constructive what you're doing, and appreciate the kind words. And I will admit I am not telling me not to be scared is not enough to make me not have a lot of hesitancy to talk about some of these issues, because it's just upside downside in terms of
Yeah,
doing the part. So that's
choose
part
your
of it.
parts. Choose your spots. If you see a spot where the risk is extremely low, take it. That's all I ask.
Absolutely. And I will continue to do that. So really appreciate it. Thanks for having me on. Appreciated the conversation. Appreciate what you're doing.
No problem, man. Here, go ahead and put yourself on mute, but stay there for me for a second. All right. All right, everybody. That is a wrap for this conversation series event. Thank you so much for joining me for this. I really enjoyed it talking with Silent Cow. And as always, thank you so much to all the patrons who tuned in and checked out this conversation. I hope that you enjoyed it, and I really appreciate your continued support. If anybody wants to help continue to support me having these conversations, you can go to my Patreon, www.patreon.com/thecontrabandwagon. And you can sign up for just $3 a month. You get access to all the raw recordings of all these conversations. If you'd rather just check out some clips, you can go on my YouTube channel of the same name, The Contraband Wagon. I'm regularly putting out weekly clips about conversations that I'm having here, and it will be twice a week in the new year, so you can check those out. Thank you so much, guys, for tuning in. Really appreciate it. Again, special thanks to all the contrabandits out there, and I'll see you next time on The Contraband Wagon, where we're changing the conversation on race. Take care, everyone.